I recently installed a Wyze cam outside of my home. In fact, I installed two, and it went quite well. I was quite pleased with the installation. I thought it was quite neat, both inside and out, and I thought I'd share it with anyone else who was considering doing the same thing. This picture shows one of the cameras mounted on the wall, on the brick wall, and you'll notice it's directly under a window. That worked out well for me logistically. I wanted it positioned there so I could see the driveway and the porch of my house, but it also meant that I didn't have to use a ladder to install it. I opened the window and did everything from that open window. This shows the internal installation. All you can see here is a wall plate with a standard USB socket in it, into which I've plugged a standard USB cable. This one isn't the original supplied by Wyze. It then runs up to an adhesive strip that tidies the cable up under the window frame. That strip runs to the end of the frame. The cable exits from there, where it goes into a wall wart. That's the plug-in power supply supplied by Wyze, and which produces the 5-volt power that travels to the camera via this outlet. This cable, by the way, only supplies power. It is not a data cable at all. All the data is carried by Wi-Fi. One of the considerations when deciding what type of camera-based security system you're going to employ is the method of storage of data, basically video. And one of them is cloud storage, and I just saw that money going up into the cloud week after week, month after month, year after year. And so the other one I considered was a DVR, but I figured, hey, if someone breaks in, they can just put the DVR under their arm and walk off with it. So I really wasn't too sure what system to go for. The other thing I had to consider was how I get this signal from the cameras to whatever storage system I've chosen. And one of the popular ones around is power over Ethernet, and another is to use coax. And I believe the power can go down the coax or on a cable Siamesed with the coax. But either way, you've got to get that routed around your house. I've installed Ethernet cables in the house before we had Wi-Fi, and they don't happen to be actually where I need them for my cameras, so I would have to go back into my attic. And in my house, this is all very difficult because I have a thick layer of insulation which is now mixed up with mouse and other rodent droppings. Dive into the eaves, where a nail invariably pierces my head while I lay on the joists trying to drill a hole through the top plate into the wall cavity where I can push a cable, and that wall cavity is full of insulation and resists any efforts I have made to push a cable in there, and it was very difficult and I didn't want to do it again. My son then told me about Wyze Cam. He'd put one inside his home and he was very pleased with it, and he told me that a wall mount system that would allow the camera to be used outside was now available. I looked at the advantages and benefits of the Wyze Cam for me, and I'm cheap, so I liked the idea that it worked on Wi-Fi, and that meant no pulling cables across the roof and down the walls of my home. It was a low-cost product and therefore very low risk. As far as cloud storage goes, it has a free 14-day 12-second cloud storage, which means basically that any events that it detects are stored in 12-second intervals over a 14-day period, so there are no forever charges. It also does continuous recording via a local micro SD card which is in the camera, and particularly in these outdoor installations, very difficult to take away. So there's no DVR to position in the home or that could be taken away. And for power, it uses standard USB cable connectors and 5-volt power, so it's very easy to adapt to different situations. My house is rather like the stereotypical doll's house in that it's got 3 windows symmetrically arranged at the top and 2 at the bottom with a middle front door. And the driveway is an in-out loop around the front, and I wanted cameras to be positioned where they could cover the porch and all of the driveway and people approaching from either side. And putting one camera under each of the 2 extreme top level windows would fulfill that function for me with about 110 degrees of coverage each, and would be easily accessible from the upper windows should I need to do any maintenance to those cameras. When I looked at the reviews on Amazon for the Wyze Cam, most of the complaints I saw were to do with the signal dropping out or not being strong enough in one way or another. And I figured that was maybe to do with the purchaser's Wi-Fi signal more than anything else. So my concern really was, in my case, although I do have a strong signal inside the house, my house is constructed with an external brick which is full thickness, some sort of concrete board on the inside of that, insulation with a vapor barrier on either side, and an internal drywall. And although that's all 11 inches thick, the Wi-Fi signal, which I've represented here with a yellow flash, isn't coming perpendicular to the wall, it's coming in at an angle, so it has to travel actually rather more than 11 inches through that wall. And I wonder whether the strong signal I had on the inside would end up as only a fair signal on the outside. So I purchased just a single Wyze Cam to start with, no enclosures, no second camera, just to test things out. On receiving the Wyze Cam, I set it up, and I'm not describing how to do that here because there's plenty of instructions elsewhere, particularly on the Wyze Cam website support section. But I set it all up, made sure it worked, and then got the USB cable and knotted it effectively round the hole in the frame and hung it out the window to see whether or not I still got a good signal. And I did, so that was the okay for me to go ahead, by the second Wyze Cam and the external enclosures. Just a small point here, but on receiving the enclosures I found that the screws supplied were rather too short to effectively and safely secure it into the wall plugs that I would have to insert into my brick. I happen to have plenty of screws around and swapped those out, swapped the originals out for number 8 3/4 inch screws. When I was looking for pictures to use in this video, I went to Amazon and found another manufacturer of an enclosure for a Wyze Cam that looked identical to that I'd purchased, but its claim to fame was that it has longer screws than the one that I bought. And so I can't have been the only one who found the screws too short. So if you're a person who doesn't have lots of screws around, then maybe you want to look for this one that has longer screws with the supplied kit. As I said before, I installed all of this by hanging out of the window. So the first thing I did was take the base of the enclosure, and using that as a kind of template, I made a starter or pilot hole using a 532 masonry drill. And then after that I removed the base and opened up that hole to 3/16 so I could put the plug in and initially secure the base so I could locate the second pilot hole. Before deciding the position of the camera and its cable, first check that when you drill the cable hole you're not going to hit any studs, any wall studs on your way through. Here I used a 5/16 by 12 inch masonry drill just because I had it, and that isn't sufficient diameter to be able to pass the Wyze USB cable that is supplied with the camera. But in my case what I did, I just ovaled it out. The connector is oval after drilling the hole. The connector is about 7/16 inches wide, and you could drill if you happen to have a bigger drill a half-inch hole or something in the wall. But I think I prefer what I did because it's a much tighter fit. It's an oval connector, and I'd ovaled out a round hole here. I drilled through the mortar because it's softer and because I happen to have grey caulk, and I wanted to fill the hole or fill the surrounds of the cable in the hole to stop water getting in when I'd finished the job. In the end, I didn't actually use the supplied cable that came with the camera, and that's because it's white and I wanted black, and also that it's 12 foot long and I didn't want to have to find room for all that cable in the wall. Not that that's a big problem. So the connectors on the end are standard connectors, the USB type A on the one end that goes into the power supply, and a USB micro B that goes on the other end, and there's plenty of options for purchasing cables like that in all sorts of different lengths. So I bought a couple of these cables, 3 foot long, and that's just about the right length for my installation to not only be easy to accommodate in the wall, but so you can actually work on the camera by bringing it back inside the window and attach the shell to it, and you'll see that later on here. One problem you could encounter by using your own USB cables through the wall is that the micro B connector has too big a molding to fit in the cavity at the back of the camera. Mine just fitted, this is one of them, but I do have some micro B connectors hanging on the end of some chargers I must have had for some old cell phones at one time, and I did note that they were too big to go in without shaving down the corners. They were kind of square. Notice too in this picture that there is a large type A USB female connector at the back of the camera, and that's for daisy chaining. Daisy chaining is for powering up more than one camera using the single power supply that's supplied with the Wyze cam. That power supply can supply, according to its rating label, at least 1 amp maximum output, and each Wyze cam uses about 0.3 of an amp, so you can run 3 of these from the standard power supply. But again, it's just a 5 volt USB power supply, so if you wanted to chain more together, you could just buy a power supply, say a 3 amp USB power supply, and you could effectively run 10 of these things off a single power supply by just daisy chaining them together. However, this is not practical with an outside installation because there is not enough room in the back of the enclosure to accept the large type A connector that has to go in the back of the camera to take power to the next one. I've photoshopped this by mirror imaging a single camera to make a double installation, but this is actually an installation that might be quite useful to many people. And as we said, daisy chaining isn't possible with the cases that are on these enclosures. So you may have to find some other way to do this if you want to use a single power supply for 2 cameras. One way to do this is with a USB power splitter cable. When we discuss how we go through the wall and the wall plate that does that, you'll see that that middle connector could be plugged into the back of the wall plate, and then 2 separate cables for the 2 cameras plugged into the 2 receptacles on either side. Having done all the drilling and cutting on the outside of the wall, it's now time to address how to get through the interior of the wall, and for that we use a low voltage power box, which isn't a box at all but a frame like this one shown here. The frame has 2 screws on diagonally opposite corners which are screwed into what are effectively wings, and as you tighten up the screw, the wings fly out and grab the inside of the drywall and pull the frame right into the drywall wall and secure it there. The frame has small holes at each corner, and these are aids for cutting the right size hole in the drywall into which it will fit. To install the box, you place its face against the wall in the position you wish it to be, and put a panel pin in one of the top corners and then level it up. With it level, you can put another panel pin in just to secure it in place. The position of the remaining two bottom holes can then be marked using some kind of pointed tool. Once that's done, the frame can be removed and the 4 holes joined with pencil marks as guides to sawing. To cut the aperture in the wall, I used a drywall saw like this one. If you don't have one, they're very inexpensive, but you can use a box cutter with care. In order to make the penetrations of the drywall before sawing, you use the pointed end of the drywall saw using a kind of pushing and wiggling motion to go through. I like to make those 4 penetrations one by one before cutting the wall, and in that way you're putting all that effort onto very strong drywall. If you cut 3 sides first, when you do the 4th side, you're left with quite a weak section on which you're pushing, and it could break open. Here I've cut the bottom side, and now I'm cutting the right side, and I'll do the other 2 in turn. With all sides cut, you can just pull the waste out of the wall. Time to push the cable from the inside to the outside of the wall, and again I'm using my own black cable here rather than the supplied Wyze cam white cable, but whichever you use, make sure it's covered well. I've just used Scotch tape here before putting it through. I don't want to get dirt inside the connector. With a nice big aperture on the inside of the wall and daylight on the outside of the wall, it was really easy to find the hole through the brick and to push the USB cable all the way through. Even though I didn't use the 12-foot long original cable, the 3-foot length that I did use is sufficiently long so that I can bring the camera end inside the window while not losing the power end into the wall, and this allows me to assemble the shell around the camera without having to do it outside of the window where I might lose the screws. With the cable through the wall, you can now thread the frame over the power end of the cable and insert it into the wall, but I recommend that before doing that you screw those screws into those wings a few times just to ease them up. They're very, very tight, and it can be quite difficult to do in the wall the first time around, but if they've been run up and down a couple of times, they work much more easily. It's not often that I prefer to use a blade screwdriver rather than a Phillips, but in this case the blade screwdriver worked a lot more effectively in tightening up these screws, because it doesn't fly off to the side as it normally would when the screw is in a recessed plastic hole like this one here. The finishing plate is called a keystone wall plate, and that aperture in the middle can take all kinds of inserts, but here we're going to use a double-ended USB insert. Don't be concerned by the fact that this one says USB 3 on the outside. USB 3 describes a protocol for the data transmission, but the power is still carried on 5 volts, the same as it is for all, so you can just plug a regular USB connector into it. This is the back of that same wall plate and the back of the same insert, and you can see that insert has a USB socket on the back as well. The insert just snaps in from the back and looks like this from the front. Before putting the Wyze cam in its enclosure, don't forget to put the micro SD card in the back to store video. Once you have the micro SD card in the camera, make sure it's set up correctly, and then you can put it into the enclosure for outside use. It's useful again having this cable come in from the outside, because all of this can be done on the inside without fear of losing screws to the outside. However, should I have lost any screws, conveniently the enclosure I bought came with plenty of them, far more than I needed, and it also came with a little screwdriver. I actually used something a little bigger. I found that more convenient, with a palm rest that allowed me to do these screws up much more easily. Once the two halves of the shell of the enclosure are together, it's a simple matter to screw the mount in, and once that's in, screw down the knurled lock nut to hold it tightly. Here's the finished installation. I actually put some cork around the cable where it entered the wall and made sure there was a drip loop in the cable so that any rain would fall away both from the camera and from the wall. So am I happy with it? Well, this picture looks pretty good, doesn't it? Someone has come up my drive and decided to break into my home and steal everything, and this picture looks pretty good. But say I wanted to look at the number plate of this vehicle. Let's zoom in and take a look and see what we can see. I think you could tell, if you know your cars, that this is a Jaguar XK8. If you know them really well, you could probably guess the age. This one happens to be a 2004, and you can see the color is silver. As far as the license plate is concerned, it does show the last three digits. You can make out 0537, which is correct, but the beginning part of the number is missing. So I guess I'd give this 6 out of 10. And here is somebody coming to break into the house. It's actually a neighbor who happened to come to visit that the camera picked up, and you can see by the red square it's detected movement around this area of the picture. And from this picture you can't tell too much, but I think you could figure it's a woman, and she is cold, so she's huddled up. You can see the snow outside, so that's no wonder. Let's zoom in on this one too. I don't really have any concerns of invading the privacy of this neighbor, because I don't think you'd recognize her from this photo. You can tell certain things about her, the color of her hair and the general build, but I don't really think that you could tell much more about her other than she's got quite a nice coat. Letting her get a little closer to see if we can get some more detail, she's actually stepped onto the porch here, so again we'll zoom in and take a look. And zoomed in, I don't really think we learn very much more, other than she doesn't look very happy as she invades my house. So from the point of view of recognizing faces, I think I'm going to give this less of a score than I did for recognizing the license plate of the car. So maybe 50%, and I think that may be a little generous. So I hope you found this video useful if you're thinking of installing one of these cameras. It tells you the amount of work that could be involved, and maybe gives you some ideas to do your own installation. So thanks for watching.